The rancher had nothing left but dust, bone-tired hands, and a single horse that had carried him through the worst of winters and the longest of summers. The land around him lay brittle, cracked open like the palm of a starving man, and every nail in his barn groaned with the weight of years. Yet when he stepped outside that evening, hearing the faint, muffled sobs drifting from the dry creek bed, something inside him stirred, something that had not moved in a long while. He followed the sound, and there, crouched behind the withered brush, were two Apache girls. Barefoot, their hair tangled with dirt and twigs, their dresses torn and stiff with dust, they clung to one another like twin sparrows in a storm. Their dark eyes flashed with fear when they saw him, but also hunger so deep it hollowed out their faces. For a long moment, the rancher simply stood there, his heart thudding against the quiet of the plains. He had been warned plenty of times by townsfolk, "Don't meddle with Apache business. You help one, you bring the wrath of 100 down on your head." Yet he could not turn away. He crouched low, his rough hands outstretched, speaking softly, though he knew his words were half lost in translation. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice as rough as gravel but steady. "Ain't no harm in me." The older sister, maybe 15, pulled the younger behind her, eyes sharp as a hawk's. The little one whimpered, whispering something in Apache that sounded like a prayer. The rancher swallowed hard. He had little left to give, but he knew he would not let them die alone in the brush. He fetched them into his barn, where the air smelled of hay and old leather, though there was little hay left to speak of. His last mule had died the winter before, and the barn echoed now with emptiness. The girls sat stiffly on the dirt floor, backs pressed to the wall, as he rummaged through his meager stores. From a tin on the shelf, he scraped out the last handful of beans, pouring them into a battered pot. He boiled them over a small fire, adding water to make them stretch. When he handed the pot to the sisters, they devoured the beans with shaking hands, too hungry even to speak. Watching them, something in the rancher's chest cracked open, a pain he hadn't felt since he buried his wife years ago. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at his table, staring at the coin scar where his small savings used to be, wondering what kind of trouble had led those girls to his land. He thought of the men in town, the ones who called him a fool for being soft-hearted. He thought of the Apache raids that had burned ranches and taken lives. He thought of his horse, the last good thing he owned, the animal that had carried him when all else failed. Then he thought of the sisters, huddled together in the barn, skin and bones, their eyes too old for their young faces. A decision was already forming, though it clawed at his soul. The next morning, the girls followed him shyly to the corral. Their bare feet kicked up dust as they walked behind him, whispering to one another in hushed voices. He opened the gate, and there stood his horse, a weathered but strong bay with a scar along its flank and eyes full of loyalty. The rancher stroked its mane, his jaw tight. "Old friend," he muttered, his throat thick. The sisters froze at the sight of the animal, awe lighting up their faces. The younger one reached out hesitant until her small hand brushed the horse's side. The animal snorted but didn't flinch. For the first time since he'd found them, the girls smiled, fragile, fleeting, but real. The rancher cleared his throat and stepped back. "She's yours," he said simply, his voice almost breaking on the words. The older sister blinked, confusion and disbelief chasing across her face. No, not take," she said in broken English, shaking her head violently. "Horse, you need," he shook his head, forcing a rough laugh. "What I need don't matter anymore. You need her. She'll carry you far, faster than your feet ever could. And maybe," he looked toward the horizon, where the mountains cut sharp into the sky, "maybe she'll carry you home." The words hung heavy, but there was no turning back. The girls looked at one another, tears welling in their eyes. The younger one clutched her sister's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Finally, the older sister nodded, stepping forward. She placed a hand on the rancher's chest, her small palm pressing against his worn shirt. "Good man," she whispered, the words halting but full of meaning. He swallowed hard, turned his face away, and lifted the younger one into the saddle. The older climbed up behind her, their thin arms wrapping around the horse's neck. The rancher gave the horse a firm pat on the flank, stepping back as the animal began to move. The girls looked over their shoulders as the horse carried them toward the edge of the plain. The younger called out something in Apache, words he couldn't understand, but that struck him deep. He raised a hand, watching until they disappeared into the distance, the bay's hooves thundering softly across the dry earth. Then he turned back to his farm, to his empty corral, to the silence that swallowed him whole. He had given away his last companion, the last remnant of hope. All he had now was the waiting. That evening the rancher sat on the porch, a cold wind cutting across the plains. He stared at the horizon where the girls had vanished, wondering if he would ever see them again, or if his act of mercy would bring ruin upon him. He thought of the way their eyes had softened, the way their shoulders had lifted when they mounted his horse. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not despair, not loneliness, but the fragile warmth of purpose. And yet deep down, a knot of fear twisted in his gut. In giving away his horse, he had given more than he owned. He had given his life into the hands of the Apache. When night finally fell, sleep came fitfully. He dreamed of hoofbeats, louder and louder, rolling across the land like thunder. He dreamed of fire and steel, of warriors with painted faces, of two young girls clinging to him, with voices like wind through the canyon. He woke before dawn, sweat cold on his brow, the air outside eerily still. Somewhere far away, at the edge of the world, a sound began to rise, the unmistakable rhythm of many horses riding together. The rancher woke before the sun rose, though his eyes had hardly closed at all. The memory of hoofbeats haunted his ears, lingering long after the dream had faded. He stepped outside into the pale blue stillness of dawn, his boots sinking into dust as he scanned the horizon. Nothing yet, only the silence of a land too dry to give back sound. He went about his chores, hauling water from the well, patching a sagging stretch of fence, not because they mattered, but because habit was all that kept his hands from trembling. The corral was empty now, and every time he looked at it, his chest tightened with a pang sharp enough to leave him breathless. The horse had been more than a beast. It had been the last anchor to his own survival. Without it, he was a man adrift in a sea of dust. By midday, he rode into town on tired legs, the walk long and punishing. The men on the porch of the general store spotted him and smirked as if they'd been waiting. "Heard you gave up your horse to a couple of wild girls," one of them drawled, leaning back on his chair with boots propped against the rail. Another spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Guess you don't care much for your own hide, huh? You'll be buzzard feed before the week's out." Their laughter rang out, harsh and cutting, but the rancher said nothing. He stepped past them, purchased a small sack of flour with the last of his trade credit, and left with his jaw set tight. Every word they spoke was a lash, but he had endured worse. If the price of conscience was mockery, he would carry it. That evening, alone in his cabin, he thought of the sisters again. He wondered how far they'd gone, if the horse still carried them swift and sure across the wild country. He pictured them reaching a camp, welcomed by firelight and familiar arms. A bitter smile tugged at his lips. Maybe they had forgotten him already, just a ragged rancher who gave up something he couldn't afford. But another thought gnawed at him, darker. Maybe they had never reached safety at all. The frontier was merciless, and a horse could carry them only so far before hunger or hunters found them. He tried to push it away, but the image of their hollow cheeks and desperate eyes refused to leave him. That night, the wind changed. It carried with it the faintest tremor, as if the earth itself was waiting. The rancher sat on the porch, rifle laid across his knees, staring out into the darkness. He couldn't explain why he kept watch, whether out of fear or hope, or some tangled knot of both. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying like ghostly warnings. He thought he saw shadows moving along the ridges, but each time he blinked, the land was empty again. When at last he went inside, he left the rifle loaded within reach. Sleep came in jagged bursts, and every time he closed his eyes, the echo of hooves returned. The following day, he forced himself back into the field. His hoe bit into the dry ground, sending up puffs of dust that clung to his skin and hair. Sweat stung his eyes, but he pressed on. Work was his shield, the rhythm of muscle and dirt keeping him from breaking under the weight of silence. At one point, he thought he heard laughter. Two voices, high and bright, carried on the wind. He straightened, breath catching, but the field was empty, the horizon bare. He shook his head, muttered a curse, and bent back to his labor. Yet part of him wondered if perhaps the girl's spirits lingered, watching him from some unseen place. As the sun bled into the horizon that evening, he cooked himself a meager supper of flour cakes and water that tasted as thin as the life he lived. He ate slowly, his eyes fixed on the chair opposite him. For a moment, he imagined the sisters sitting there, one serious, protective, the other small and wide-eyed, both grateful yet afraid. He imagined himself offering them food, hearing their voices filling the silence of the cabin. The ache that settled in his chest was worse than hunger. He realized then that it wasn't just the horse he missed. It was them. Their presence, fragile though it was, had filled a void he hadn't known was so deep. Later that night, a storm rolled in from the west. Lightning split the sky, jagged veins of fire illuminating the plains. The rancher stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the rain whip across the barren earth. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the girls. Wherever they were, he hoped the horse carried them fast enough to outrun the storm. Thunder shook the ground, and for an instant he thought again of 100 hooves pounding across the land. His heart lurched, but when the thunder faded, only rain remained. He let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing a hand to his chest. The storm left the land slick with mud, but by morning the sun returned, fierce and unrelenting. The rancher's boots squelched as he crossed the yard, his eyes red from another sleepless night. He fed what little grain he had left to the chickens, their clucks the only sound in the emptiness. He moved like a man condemned, waiting for something he couldn't name. When he looked toward the horizon, the knot in his stomach tightened. The ridges were still bare, but he swore he could feel a stirring beyond them, like an army gathering breath. As dusk fell once more, he sat on his porch, staring at the sky streaked in crimson and gold. The world was holding its breath, and so was he. The rifle lay ready, though he knew it would be a toothpick against what might come. The rancher closed his eyes, leaned his head back and whispered into the cooling air, "If they made it home, let that be enough. If they didn't, let me be the one who pays." His voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and quiet resolve. The land swallowed his words, but the silence that followed felt heavy with reply. And then, just before the first stars broke the sky, he heard it again. Faint, distant, unmistakable, the rolling thunder of hooves. Not one horse, not 10, but hundreds, a wave of sound surging closer with every heartbeat. He rose slowly to his feet, heart hammering. The sisters were gone, but something else was coming, something vast and unstoppable. And deep in his bones, the rancher knew dawn would bring his reckoning.